Hello everyone. In this video, we are providing an overview of the CA 2025 assessment process. I'd like to remind you that there is detailed training that will be provided for all of the role players in the assessment process to upskill you from the 2016 process to CA 2025. This video is simply to provide you with an overview of the assessment process, the instruments that will be used, and the key role players. Resources that might be useful to you in watching this video. I would suggest that you have Guide 4, the overview of the CA 2025 assessment process and instruments, open so that you can follow along and read more detail as we move through the video. Guide 5 might be of use to you, but I would suggest that you use it after you've watched this video and perhaps when you're watching video 5. It's just that we make reference to assessing proficiency in the learning outcomes and the decision trees. That's why we're providing that as one of the resources. And then obviously video 5 as well that I've just mentioned, which provides more information on using the decision trees. Template 1 is also referred to. The training plan is the first thing that you need to set up to bring your trainees onto the electronic assessment tool. You will link your trainees to a specific training plan, and that will determine how the assessment process actually flows. It will help you assess development needs. It will create the PDS cycles that the trainee needs to follow. So really the training plan is at the crux of the assessment process. But we aren't going to refer to it directly today. I just want you to hold it at the back of your mind when we are thinking about assessment. So in considering assessment under CA 2025, we really need to understand the shift between the 2016 program and CA 2025. Under the 2016 program, we had a number of technical and professional competencies, as well as professional conduct values that we assessed. And the tasks related to all three areas. Under CA 2025, we are still going to expose trainees to technical work that a chartered accountant or an AGA would perform on the job. And we're going to track that exposure. But what we really want to develop and assess are the underlying behaviors, the professional values and attitudes, and the underlying abilities, the enabling competencies or acumens. So the assessment process of CA 2025 is completely focused on the professional values, attitudes, and acumens, and the learning outcomes that show professional competence. Having said that, you can't develop and assess the professional competencies without reference to the technical context. The technical context is really the soil that provides the trainees the opportunity to grow in the various professional values, attitudes, and acumens. As part of the formative assessment process, the learning outcome reviews, the trainees will document the technical context and then consider how they demonstrated the different learning outcomes within that context. In using the decision trees, so when we're starting to look at Guide 5 and Video 5, you will notice that technical context is completely integrated with the acumens and the professional values and attitudes. You can't assess proficiency in the PVAAs without the technical context. Let's take a moment to consider the principles of assessment. So really, in my mind, the formative and summative assessment principles are pretty much the same as under the 2016 program. Formative assessment still allows for regular feedback on the trainee's progress, and summative assessment benchmarks the trainee's proficiency to the exit level expectations. What is different is the way that we conduct formative assessment and the way that we conduct summative assessment. So it's important to look at the assessment instruments under CA 2025. Formative assessment is conducted through a learning outcome review. And really what this is an opportunity for trainees to regularly reflect on how they're starting to demonstrate the learning outcomes. The learning outcome review replaces the TSR and the PSR. And I'm saying it replaces the TSR and the PSR, not just the PSR, because the trainee will document the technical context and evidence around how they demonstrated the learning outcome in the LOR. Summative assessment is conducted through the Professional Development Summary, the PDS. The PDS replaces the ANA, which we're used to from the 2016 program. So let's talk about the learning outcome review in a little bit more detail. The first thing that the trainee needs to do in setting up the learning outcome review is to choose which reviewer they're going to submit the LOR to. So the LOR is linked to a particular individual who is going to review that learning outcome review for the trainee. We'll talk a little bit more about the reviewer role and why this is the case in a moment, but just hold that thought for now. In the learning outcome review, the trainee will document, first of all, the technical context. This is a required component of the learning outcome review. They'll document what they actually did while they were demonstrating this learning outcome. And they will link that technical context to one or more technical competency learning outcomes from the training plan, or perhaps other learning outcomes which they demonstrated which aren't on their training plan, so long as it comes from the overall competency framework. That's step one. After that, they will document evidence of how they demonstrated the learning outcome. This is also a required component, and there is some guidance within the tool. And what will also come through in the training is that there are certain quality requirements in terms of how they document that evidence. Two optional components that the trainee may also reflect on and that we are encouraging so that they can start understanding their own learning journey. First of all, we're encouraging trainees to reflect on any supportive training that allowed them to demonstrate the learning outcome or enabled them to demonstrate the learning outcome. And when we talk about training, it could be anything. It could be formal training that was obtained during a course. It could be a simulation that they went on. It could be a conversation that they had with a mentor or a senior member of staff or even a peer. It could be a YouTube video that they watched. It really could be anything that helped them with an understanding that they were then able to play out in real life in the scenario that they're using for their evidence. The other optional component that we're encouraging trainees to reflect on is on their development needs. And we are bringing the development conversation into the learning outcome review so that trainees understand that they are expected to continually develop during the learning process. They're not expected to be able to demonstrate proficiency at the exit level right at the start. This is really encouraging trainees to go, how could I do better next time? How could I better demonstrate this learning outcome towards the ultimate expectations at the end? The development reflections from the learning outcome review will also be available as part of the professional development summary, so that the evaluator and assessor can also see the progression of the trainee throughout the training contract in coming up with a formal development plan. The learning outcome review is really an opportunity for trainees to request regular feedback. So what we are encouraging is that trainees request feedback as regularly as possible, but an absolute minimum is that they must request feedback from a reviewer at least once a month. Now, obviously, if the learning outcome review is linked to a specific reviewer, it might be that it's only relevant for one particular learning outcome. So this reviewer saw that I was doing this on the job. So I want to give them my learning outcome review so that they can review me. This piece of evidence would make more sense to give to somebody else to review. The learning outcome review, the way that it is set up in the electronic assessment tool, is that there only needs to be one element of technical context, in other words, linked to one learning outcome within the training plan or within the overall competency framework, and evidence provided for only one professional value, attitude, or acumen learning outcome, either a PVA or an acumen at a minimum in order to submit that for review. We've made it as simple as possible so that trainees really at the end of any working day could quickly put something into an LOR, pop it off to a reviewer, and get some feedback immediately. It's also to simplify the process for the reviewer so that the reviewers are not having to look at a massive amount of information and wade through pages and pages of evidence in order to provide feedback to a trainee. We really are wanting the assessment process to facilitate regular feedback. That's the purpose of the learning outcome review. Please consider your office policy in terms of how regularly you would like to see the reviews happening. This is really a diary type entry, a journal, a reflective journal that getting the trainee into the habit of regularly reflecting on their development, regularly reflecting on their proficiency in the learning outcomes, and also an opportunity to provide regular feedback. So your office policy will set up the specifics in terms of your office, and the electronic assessment tool will also enable whatever behaviors you are wanting to create or instill within your trainees. Remember, from Psych's side, the requirement is that there must be an LOR at least once a month. So let's come back to the reviewer role in the learning outcome review. The reviewer's role is to corroborate evidence presented by the trainee. The first thing that they're looking for is this valid? Did the trainee actually do this? Is this technical context what actually played out in this job, or in this task, or in this activity, or in the scenario that the trainee presents? And is the evidence provided of sufficient quality that it can be used for assessment purposes? In other words, that when I apply the decision tree, I'm able to actually give the trainee a rating. That means that the reviewer actually needs to understand from a summative level what is expected in the professional values and attitudes, because those are only assessed at a summative level. So the reviewer will be checking for the professional values and attitudes whether the context is clearly set out and whether the trainee has adequately described how they demonstrated that learning outcome. For the acumens, the reviewer will actually be providing a rating. So the 4 dimensions that are used to rate the acumens, the reviewer will need to hold that at the back of their mind when they look at the technical context and when they look at the evidence that the trainee has documented to determine whether it is of sufficient quality to provide a rating. Remember, the trainee will have gone through that process as well. So the trainee also has to rate themselves on the acumen. So they will have an opportunity to determine whether they have actually presented evidence in a way that it can be rated. Again, please remember your office policy in terms of what your requirements are from a trainee's perspective, in terms of what you require your trainees to present, and also in terms of the role of the reviewer. Who are you choosing to review the trainees, and who are you encouraging your trainees to choose as their reviewers, bearing in mind the requirement for the reviewer to corroborate evidence presented? Okay, so let's talk about the professional development summary. In the CA 2025 training program, you as a training office have an option in terms of how frequently you would like the professional development summary to be conducted. Do you want it to be on a 3-monthly cycle, a 4-monthly cycle, or a 6-monthly cycle? Now, I can see many of you going, why on earth would I want to have a more frequent summative assessment cycle? But in some training offices, particularly those that train through rotations, a 4-monthly or 3-monthly cycle might make more sense in terms of the format and structure of the training program. The minimum requirement stays the same as in the 2016 program. We do want a summative assessment to be conducted at least every 6 months. The professional development summary cycles are set out upfront when you prepare your training plan for a particular trainee. And I'm saying a particular trainee because you can select different cycles and different formats for different trainees. But when you set up your training plan, whether you're doing one overall for all trainees or for individual trainees, you will set out the PDS cycles. You can't have a 3-month and then a 6-month and then a 4-month. You're picking one. So we're not that flexible, but we are allowing some flexibility. So let's say you pick a 6-monthly PDS cycle. In that 6 months, what we are expecting is that the trainee will have provided at least one piece of evidence in each of the 7 competency areas. So what do we mean by that? There are 3 competency areas within the professional values and attitudes. We're looking at ethics, citizenship, and lifelong learning. And there are 4 competency areas within the acumens: business acumen, decision-making acumen, relational acumen, and digital acumen. And we're expecting that trainees provide at least one piece of evidence in each of those. Now you can work it out, right? There are 95 different learning outcomes. So that's not going to be enough. But we are saying that we want to encourage trainees to keep thinking broadly. We don't want them to hone in on only relational acumen or focus so much on digital acumen that they forget about the other 5 competency areas. That's why we're encouraging trainees to keep reflecting across the board at all of the competency areas. You'll notice that many of them are actually interrelated. The trainee might demonstrate something within the ethics value and attitude, and at the same time they're demonstrating something within the relational acumen, or they might demonstrate something within the digital acumen that actually also speaks to one of the business acumen learning outcomes. So often you'll find that trainees will provide one piece of technical context and then also be able to link it to several different learning outcomes across the professional values and attitudes and the acumens. Let's come back to the professional development summaries. Key components. The first thing that will happen when a trainee generates a professional development summary, they will get a feedback summary of how the learning outcome review process unfolded during that professional development summary cycle. The feedback summary will reflect when the trainee submitted the learning outcome review to a reviewer for review, when the reviewer first started the process of review on that LOR, and when the review was completed. In other words, it was submitted towards the PDS. That will allow the trainee to reflect on whether the feedback provided during that period of time was sufficient, or if there were any problems that they encountered. Let's say that they missed a month in terms of an learning outcome review. They could then provide information to the evaluator and the assessor on why that happened. For example, they might have been on a month's study leave, or perhaps they were on sick leave, or perhaps something happened with the job and it meant that they completed it one week late. All of that is really for use for the office to determine whether the feedback is happening regularly and whether trainees are doing what they need to do and whether the reviewers are doing what they need to do. So it's really coming back to you as a training office to determine if anything needs to be tweaked in terms of how you're providing feedback to your trainees. The second thing that will come out in the professional development summary is a consideration of the range and depth of exposure, and this includes the core hours. So the range and depth of exposure is really prompted by the learning outcomes from a technical context perspective that the trainee documents in the learning outcome reviews compared to what was expected from the training plan. Now, this is not cast in stone. This is to allow you to reflect on whether the trainees are gaining the professional experience and the exposure that is required. You might find that the trainee is selecting learning outcomes that are not even on your training plan, and actually it's working out just fine. But there is also a chance that the trainee might be lacking in a certain area. And this is just to prompt you when you come to the development plan, whether anything else needs to be taken into account. Did the trainee miss out on a rotation, which they should have gone on for whatever reason? Do you need to reprioritize that? Should the trainee still be exposed to a tax calculation because there's something missing in terms of one of their decision-making acumens, or you believe that that will help them to demonstrate something around lifelong learning? So whatever it is that you determine in your training office, this is provided to you as an input in terms of the assessment process. In the electronic assessment tool, you will also capture the core hours. You can capture it overall, the same as you do in the ANA, but we will also be building in a timesheet module so that you can bring in the core hours in more detail if necessary. And for those offices that don't have a separate billing system, you can actually capture the trainees' time against the different competence areas. The third area is academic progress, not too different from the current process. What the trainee is also able to do within this area is to request support. Now we're getting to the crux of the PDS and what it's there to do. Once you've moved through the feedback summary, the range and depth of exposure, the academic progress, you come to the summative assessment of proficiency. At this point, all of the information captured in the learning outcome reviews relevant for this PDS cycle will be pulled through into this. And the trainee has an opportunity to provide more information if they want to. And this is really where the evaluator and the assessor come in and provide an overall summative rating. The summative assessment process in CA 2025 is based on what comes through from the learning outcome reviews. You will see that the decision trees used at the PDS are different from the decision tree in the learning outcome review. First of all, there is no rating provided for the professional values and attitudes within the LORs. It's only provided at a summative level in the PDS, so that's a separate decision tree. And then for the acumens, the decision at a PDS level is based on the ratings that are pulled through from the learning outcome reviews. In video 5, we will go into detail around how you use the decision trees and why we came to certain ways of doing things in the CA 2025 program. For now, I just want to remind you that the reviewer will have provided ratings for the acumens, and there's a decision for the evaluator and the assessor for acumens, and then there's a separate decision tree for the professional values and attitudes, which are only assessed at a summative level. And their context and frequency become important. So actually the amount of evidence that the trainee has provided or individual examples of evidence come into play from a summative assessment perspective. And then the last thing for the PDS, which should be no surprise, it's very similar to the ANA, we're having a look at a development plan. The development plan in the electronic assessment tool is automated to some extent because you're reflecting on development as you move through the summative assessment of proficiency. So it's generated from the information that's already been captured. It is based on what is expected and set out in the training plan. There is the opportunity to tweak information in the training plan, but you also need to understand the consequences of changing a training plan at a particular time within the trainee's development. And that will all be set out in more detail when we come to the demonstration on the electronic assessment tool and the training around assessment. Basically, what I'm saying is use your training plan to guide your trainees. The expected levels of proficiency set out in the training plan will prompt them in terms of where they need to focus. And the training plan, the integrated exposure plan, will give them an idea of the areas in which they should be gaining practical experience and perhaps also prompt some thinking around where they could be looking to learn or demonstrate certain acumens and professional values and attitudes. I keep coming back to your office policy. Much of the assessment process under CA 2025 is driven by what would make sense in your training environment. So as you start implementing the program, think about what makes sense for you. Lastly, I'd like to mention the key role players in the assessment process. We decided to keep the key role players the same as in the 2016 program. So there is still a trainee role, a reviewer role, an evaluator role, and an assessor role. There is some streamlining in the electronic assessment tool where the evaluator and the assessor are the same person, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. I also want to remind you that the reviewer must be somebody who is able to corroborate what the trainee did in terms of the quality of the evidence and the technical context. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to seeing you in the next video where we dive into the decision trees in a little bit more detail.